Hey folks, Colin here from Something's Recording, and today I'm going to show you how to use an expander to reduce bleed on your drums. We're going to be talking about bleed on snare drum today, but before we dive in, if you're ready to level up your snare drum recordings and make sure you don't have to deal with any of the problems we talk about here today, then I have just the thing for you. It is my essential guide to recording snare drum. It's a simple PDF that will walk you through everything you need to know about recording snare drum, from mic choice to mic position to input gain, to make sure you get a polished and professional sounding snare recording without any more back and forth, without any more hassle. It's a completely free guide and you can download it below using the link in the video description. Now let's jump in here and take a look at how to reduce bleed on the snare drum. Let's start by me showing you the finished drum sound for this track, and then I'll solo up our snare drum and I will take off our expander, and you can hear the big difference that we get in the hi-hat bleed, especially coming through our snare drum here. So here's our finished drum sound to begin with. So as you can hear, when we click off this expander on our snare drum, it essentially becomes a hi-hat mic and not a snare drum mic. So we lose all of the emphasis on our snare drum, no more punch, and it gets a lot looser on our snare drum, right? We hear a lot more of the ring afterwards and a lot more hi-hat bleed mainly. So to get rid of that, all we're adding is this expander, right? So we have our finished snare drum mix. Instead of putting this at the beginning and reducing the bleed beforehand, I'm putting this at the end. That way I can craft my snare drum sound and then put this on and limit the bleed. So I'm not fighting the bleed beforehand, I'm fighting it afterwards. So I can get my good snare drum sound, then reduce the bleed on that snare sound. That way I can boost all the high end I need beforehand and then reduce that bleed afterwards. So instead of putting the expander at the start and getting rid of the bleed and then boosting top end on top of that and bringing some of the bleed back in and then having to deal with it again afterwards, just taking care of it at the end here. Let's start raw snare drum here and we'll talk about the settings we're using to reduce this bleed here. So quite a lot of hi-hat bleed there, pretty much takes over our drum sound. We're actually going to start from scratch here, and I'm going to pull in a fresh expander. That way we can do this start to finish here. If we solo up our snare drum here, these are the default settings. We don't need the default settings. It's always cool to look on your expander if you have any kind of settings to start with. The snare top setting is actually the setting that I started with here, and then I just went and tweaked it. So I want my attack as fast as it can possibly be. That way we don't lose anything as it opens and closes on our snare drum. I don't want to lose any of the attack on the snare drum or any of the transient by the expander opening too slow or closing too fast, right? Next thing we want to do, ratio, 1:2 ratio, so not too aggressive, right? Not really sharp like that, and not too gentle here. We want to make sure that we're reducing that bleed. Range, I usually like to sit somewhere around -40, but it's something you can adjust as you pull in the expander, as you get it activated. So let's hit play here, and we'll pull down our threshold till we're sitting somewhere where it's sounding good on our snare drum. That sounded about good for me. We're not going all the way, right? We're not eliminating the bleed on the snare drum because I still want them to be live drums, right? We're not reducing the bleed on our kick and snare, or I do have it cut out on our toms because I don't want anything ringing all the way through. But I'm still keeping some of the bleed so it sounds more natural. If we cut the bleed entirely and we have a gate, if we were using a gate to open and close really aggressively on our snare drum and get rid of all the bleed completely, we would have to pull up a lot more of our overheads and we kind of ruin our drum balance, right? Because we have to kind of cover up the aggressive opening and closing of our gate. By using an expander like this, we can be a little bit more broad, a little bit more gentle, and ease back that bleed and make it sound more natural. Because obviously you're going to get some bleed from a snare mic, from your hi-hat, from your cymbals, right? That's natural. That's going to happen. So we're easing the bleed back to a more natural position so we can ease up our overheads a little bit more and we don't have to have them tucked so far back because all our hi-hat sound is coming from our snare drum. That's about a good level for me. Now we're going to play with our release so we can get the back end of our snare drum back. Right now it was a little bit too tight, and I'll show you that. I'll go a little bit faster. You can hear the faster you go with your release, the tighter your snare drum is going to be. So the faster the expander is going to let go and come back and reduce the bleed. You want to go back so it's kind of sitting in time with your snare drum. So it lets go to let your snare drum come in and then comes back to reduce the bleed. So it eases back in like your snare drum sustain drops off. So let's set that in time here. That's really tight right there. So if you wanted a really tight snare drum sound, you could use your expander to get that sound. You could tighten up a snare drum that was a little loose sounding or it rang a little bit too long. You could use your expander in this way if you wanted to. We don't need that here, so let's ease the release back till our snare sounds are a little bit more natural. I'm liking right there around the 300 or 284 area. It's still a nice tight snare drum sound, and we reduce a little bit of that sustain, a little bit of that ring on the end of it, but we keep the bleed at a natural stage. So our snare drum hits and then our expander closes down to keep that bleed in the background, keep it at a more natural space. Let's do an A-B here on this and see where we're sitting. So really pulling that hi-hat bleed back on our snare drum sounds a lot more natural, a lot like the snare drum was recorded a little bit more pristinely. Let's put the rest of our drums in here and see where we're sitting. We'll do another A-B on our expander and see how much of that bleed we're getting out of here. Really tightens up our snare drum sound, allows us to keep it higher in the mix because it's no longer essentially a hi-hat mic. It is our snare mic. We get a stronger snare drum sound. We control the bleed coming from our snare mic. Allows us to keep our overheads at a higher position so we can hear our cymbals, and we get a more natural hi-hat sound because we have a little bit of bleed from our snare drum, a natural amount of bleed, and we have the hi-hat sound from our overhead. So it really helps to clean up our drum sound. All we're doing here, throwing out our expander. Use a preset. If there's a preset on your expander, they're always a good place to start. It'll give you a good idea of the settings you need for a particular unit, whether it's a kick drum or a snare drum. Then tweak it from there. Like I said, I usually like my range around -40. It's a good spot or a good amount of reduction for me. Pull your threshold up to where it's letting your snare through when your snare hits, and it's leaving enough room for any kind of ghosting or anything like that, any kind of rolls. I like to set my attack as fast as possible. That way we don't cut off any of the attack, any of the transient on our snare drum. And then set your release so it's in time with your drum. I hope that was helpful for you. Like I said at the beginning of the video, if you're ready to take your snare recordings to the next level and make sure you don't have to deal with any of the problems we talked about here today, click the link in the description and download my essential guide to recording snare drum. That way you can start creating more professional snare recordings in less time. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.